to get into the message. I didn't hear Craig's message, and I don't think it's posted up on YouTube yet. But I had the notes, and I kind of have the idea of what he went over, and I think this is a good segue from him talking about how God heals a person to what I'm going to be talking about, which is the result of the healing, which is the freedom that comes from giving yourself to Christ. But I think to really grasp the the severity and the importance of Christ coming and what he does for us, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. And I kind of think about when people talk to a new Christian and they're trying to figure out, well, where do I start in the Bible? And a lot of the times people will rush somebody to John or to Matthew or Mark or whatever. They'll rush them to the gospel. They want to get them to Jesus as fast as possible. But I think you miss the gravity of Jesus when you skip everything else that came before him, when you don't realize how much bondage and sin and trying and failing that came before Christ. And so I'm not going to start all the way in Genesis, but I will start with Israel in the beginning, the beginnings of God making them into a nation, because I think in Israel we get a lot of ourselves. They're almost a mirror. I won't say almost, but they are a mirror of what we are. They reflect exactly the stiff-necked, hard-headed, disobedient, sinful nature that we all have inside of ourselves, and it's put on full display for all of us to read and to see over and over and over again. And so, well, he agrees. Ledger agrees. And so I want to start with, let me see what verse this is going to be. Let's go to Exodus 1. Can you hold this for me? Can you get my, you don't have to hold it up, just hold the papers. Go to Exodus 1, verse 13 through 14. I'm just using it as a table. Yeah, as a podium. So Exodus 1, it'll be verse 13 through 14. And it's speaking about the Egyptians and their relationship to the Israelites. And it says, and they worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of works in the field. And all their hard labor in Egypt, the Egyptians used them or worked them ruthlessly. And you see here that their time, and it's something that we all know, but their time in Israel or their time in Egypt was a harsh time. And it was 400 years of slavery and bondage and being under the thumb of Pharaoh, being used to make bricks and build cities and monuments that they would never actually own themselves, that they would never actually enjoy. And you see in that it's the same coin, just different side, that sin does the same thing to a man. It works him, it crushes him under his fist, it causes him to work and to strive and to do all these things that ultimately amount to nothing, that ultimately they don't get to enjoy, that they maybe for a season enjoy, but it'll ruin them in the end. And so I think it's here that we have to start, because you have to experience the bitterness of being in bondage before you can really understand the sweetness of being free and having liberty and being in Christ. And I think it's not impossible, but it's a hard task for us to really put ourselves in their shoes, because we live in a country, like Derek was saying, where we can worship freely, where we can come together like this, and where we're just free. I can come and leave as I please. I can work or not work somewhere as I please. I can do as I please, and I've been that way since birth. And so it's hard for me to really put myself in the shoes of somebody who's been in physical bondage, who's been in physical slavery, who has a cruel master over them. But ultimately, we all come from a place where we do have a cruel master, where we are in bondage, where we are under the thumb of a cruel master, because we all come from a state of being sinful. And We don't really get the gravity of how wicked sin is unless we can look at the physical bondage of Israel first and realize that that's only a symptom of them being under sin, being in away from Christ. Being under the thumb of Pharaoh is like being under the thumb of sin, and to really understand that, you have to see the dualism there, that it's not just a story about these people who are becoming free from their physical bondage, but they're becoming free from sin, or you would hope so. They don't have Christ yet, but we'll get to that point. And so I focus on Exodus 1:13 because it it really sums up what they were going through while they were in bondage to Pharaoh. And so I put here, into that darkness, into that moment of being crushed under Pharaoh, having spent 400 years, generation after generation, under the thumb of Pharaoh. You see, God looks upon his people. He's not far from them. He hasn't forgotten them, even though a long time has passed, generation after generation. And so in the minds of men, they would feel like they have been forgotten by God, but God never forgot his covenant and his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so you see in Exodus, you go over to the next chapter, and you see that Israel is groaning and they're calling out to God. And so it'll be chapter 2, verses 23 to 25. And it says, and I'm Exodus chapter 2. So flip over to the next chapter, and it'll be verse 23 through 25. And you see here that God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant, and God looked upon them, and God was concerned with them. And really, that's the state of man when they are in that sinful position, but they call out and they cry out to God for help and for mercy. You see David, as he's crying out to God. In Psalms 51, he says, the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart. Oh God, you will not despise. And it reminds me of a hymn that, I don't know where I really come across these hymns, but it reminds me of a hymn, and it says, prayer is the burden of a sigh, the falling of a tear, the upward glancing of an eye, when none but God is near. And I think sometimes we can think that praying to God is just giving him a list of I wants, but true prayer is when you're desperate for him, when you're pouring yourself out to him, when you are under that oppression and you're crying out to him and you're groaning. That's what he hears. When we just come to him and we offer him a list of, I want this, and I want the nice car, and I want the promotion, and I want to make more money, and I want this and that, God doesn't hear that. I mean, he hears it, but his answer to that is probably going to be no. Sometimes he's willing to answer those things, but the prayer that he is sure to hear, that he's sure to answer, is the desperate prayers of somebody that's being oppressed, somebody that's crying out, somebody that's pouring out themselves to him. And it's not to say that you have to be in slavery for God to hear your prayers, but your prayers have to be sincere and deep, and they have to be an outpouring of yourself to him. Prayer is a form of worship, and it's more than just, you wouldn't say you're worshiping God by moving your lips to the sounds or the words to a song. It's more than that. It's a pouring out of yourself. And prayer is the same thing. It's more than just moving your lips or thinking your thoughts and focusing them towards God. It's an outpouring of yourself. And that's what God responds to. And so you see here that God responds to his people on the basis of his covenant, but also because they cried out and they groaned, and because he saw their suffering, and because he won't despise a broken heart. He won't despise a contrite spirit. He won't turn away or not respond to the fact that somebody is genuinely pouring out themselves to him. And the answer to that prayer might not be in the form that you're expecting. I'm sure the Israelites were like, just come today and save us now in this moment. But God decided that he was going to use that moment to show his wonders and to magnify himself and to display the 10 plagues to Pharaoh and to break that nation, because that nation also was in sin. It wasn't just the Israelites that were in sin, but it was the Egyptians that were in sin because they built a nation on the backs of slaves. And so you see here that God is concerned with his people. He hears their groans, he looks upon them, and we all know the story of Moses. He sends Moses, he sends Aaron to Pharaoh, but Pharaoh's heart is hard. And I think this is also the a mirror for some people. Some people are like Israel, where they groan and they cry out and they're willing to be delivered by God. But some are like Pharaoh and their hearts are hard and they come in contact with God. And now you're at odds with God, which makes absolutely no sense because you're not going to win. But your heart can be so hard that you'll think that you can win, or you'll know that you'll lose, but you still don't want to turn. You still don't want to give yourself over to God. And so one of the first things that Moses does is ask Pharaoh, can they go out into the wilderness for 3 days to sacrifice to their God? And Pharaoh could have said yes. He could have been the Pharaoh that freed the Israelites, that allowed them to go and worship their God. But instead, he had a hard heart, like we often do sometimes. And so he had to suffer under, now that God was freeing the Israelites from being under the fist of Pharaoh, you see that Pharaoh is now going to be under the fist of God because he's unwilling. He has a hard heart. He doesn't want to give in to what God is not asking, but demanding of him. And it's really, that's our relationship with God. God doesn't force us to do things, but he commands us to do things. And so you see here, Pharaoh's heart is hard. And God reaches out to touch Egypt because of Pharaoh's hard heart. And a book that I find to be a very hard read, but a very, I guess, enlightening read is Lamentations, because I think it gives you insight to what it looks like when God reaches out to not just strike a nation, but to strike a person. And so I have here, if you'll turn with me to Lamentations, I got it right this time. Chapter 1. So Lamentations chapter 1. It's a book I'm sure most people, if you haven't read, well, I'll say this: if you haven't read it, you should read it, with the warning that it is a hard book and it covers topics that are not easy. It's Lamentations 1. It is a hard book to find. It's not a huge book. So it'll be Lamentations 1, and I'll be reading from verses 13 and 14. You good? And it says, from on high he sent fire, sent it down into my bones. He spread a net for my feet and turned me back. He made me detestable, faint all the day long. My sins have been bound into a yoke. By his hands they were woven together. They have come upon my neck, and the Lord has sapped my strength. He has handed me over to those who I cannot withstand. And what I'm really focusing on is the fact that he took the sin of the nation of Israel at this time. Or you could say that, depending on, your tradition or how you read this, it was a book written by Jeremiah. At least that's my understanding of it. He would fit the profile of somebody writing a book this depressing, the weeping prophet. But I focus on the fact that he took the yoke and he hung it around their neck. And he does the same thing to Egypt as he's trying to free his people. He took their sin and he made them wear them like shackles. They couldn't get from under what was going to happen to them. The 10 plagues were going to happen. God's wonders were going to be shown in Egypt because Pharaoh's hard heart. And so it's by that judgment that the people of God are delivered. It's by the fact that God would send 10 plagues, that he would send the frogs and the gnats and the Passover and all these things. And through all this suffering, you get the deliverance of God's people. And again, this is just a mirror of our experience when we are coming out of sin. It's usually through suffering. You're going to lose something. You're going to have to sacrifice and give up things. You're not going to be able to live the way you were living before you came to Christ. And oftentimes, I find that when a person is going through that, God takes them through the very same motions that he took the Israelites. He sends them somebody, or he calls that person. They go through whatever it is that they're going to go through, and then through that suffering or those plagues or God showing his wonders, he takes them into the wilderness, which is the second part of this. So God starts off, or we start off in Egypt, and as we cry out to God, he hears us if your cries are sincere and if you are actually pouring out yourself. And understand that God he knows the heart of a person. He knows when it's just, oh, I've sinned, God forgive me, and then you go back to sinning. Or if it's, I've sinned and I feel the weight and the depth of that, and I actually cry out and pour myself out to him because I want to be delivered from whatever vice it is that you're struggling with, or whatever thing it is that's causing you to sin or stumble. He knows the difference between a heart that is actually turned towards him, or you're just using the words, you're just putting on the act. And so you start out in Egypt, all of us, and then we're led into the wilderness. And you see here in the wilderness that it's where every man fails. It's where every man realizes that he can't be perfect. You can be given the law, but the law doesn't have the power to actually save you. It only has the power to expose that you do need the saving. And so immediately after being freed from the the shackles or the bondage or the oppression of Egypt, the Israelites go out into the wilderness. And I find it funny, but it's also sad because it is a reflection of us that almost immediately they're asking for Aaron to make gods for them. They go from seeing all 10 wonders and being freed and knowing that God exists and having the Red Sea parted and seeing fire come from the sky and seeing the Nile turn into blood and all these things to, well, Moses has been gone too long, so can we get a golden calf? But I wonder how they could see all those things and still come to that point where they're asking for the jewelry that God caused the Egyptians to be um, willing to give the Israelites. They used that jewelry to make a golden calf. And I wonder how they could be so hard headed, how they could be so willing to turn to another God just like that, because Moses was gone a little bit too long. But that's how we react. We go through and we get into the wilderness and we become unsure because we can't see where we're going. We can't see the end of the destination, and we feel like God is far from us. And then we start to wander a little bit. We start to slide back into the sin. We start to return. We start to long for Egypt again because they had the onions and the leeks and the good meat and the things that we think we need to live, the things that our flesh desires. And so I anybody who hasn't read through the Old Testament, or anybody who has read through the Old Testament, I would recommend you look at Israel. Give them some slack, because they really are just us. They really are how we react to God working in our lives. We ask for different gods. We don't make golden calves. I hope not. But we make other things God. We make other people gods. We make money God, or cars, wealth, whatever it is. We make those things gods. And so we don't live in a world where people don't worship idols anymore. We have many more idols. They're just well hidden now. They're not golden calves. They're not rams and bulls and birds. And I mean, some people still do. But I'll say in this nation, our gods look different now. Their football teams and their relationships and their children and their spouses and their all these random things that we can turn into gods. And it's usually self that becomes our God. And so they ask, make us gods, which is Exodus 32. Actually, that's the wrong scripture. Um, turn with me to Exodus 32, 1. 1. Exodus 32, verse 1. You didn't bring one?
No, I just really like the Bible.
Oh. Your font is huge. You gotta tell me where you got that from.
We were talking about the font, man.
Did we?
I didn't mean to get this big of a font. But...
I'm not making fun. I would love to.
It was an accident.
Yeah.
I think that's where I'm at. Yesterday, we were doing this challenge here, and he had to go like this.
So you did need that font. Okay.
No.
But I bring us to Exodus 32 because here you see, I can tell you in full the what's happening. It says, when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. So Moses goes up the mountain to worship God and to come down with the 10 Commandments. And really a lot of times Moses was interceding for the hardness of the people. And he takes too long doing the good thing that God is requiring him to do. And so the people start to fall away because he's taking too long. They can't see him. They don't know what's going on. They don't know where we're going to go, who's going to lead us, instead of being patient and waiting on God. And that's really what we do often. We get into these situations, life starts lifing, and things happen, and struggles come, but we can't see God, and we don't know where he's leading us, and we don't know where it's going to go and how to proceed. And so we start to stray, and that self starts to come out, that the idol of self. Well, if God's not going to handle it for me, then I'll handle it myself. And that's really where the trouble and the struggle and the worry comes, because now we're God. Now we have to take charge. Now we're in control instead of letting God be in control. And again, I go back to the God in the process of freeing the Israelites from the Egyptians. I'm sure that in their minds, they wanted God to show up and that day free them, take them away, place them in the promised land that day, that hour, I'm sure, and just have it be done. But God had other plans, and he had a different way of doing it that we can now, I don't even know how long ago Exodus was, 4,000 years later, 3,000 years later, read about it and really draw something from it instead of just reading God freed the Israelites, period. That's the end of Exodus. And so there's a reason and a rhyme to why God does the things he does. And it's sometimes he lets us know why he's doing it a certain way, and sometimes he doesn't. But he has shown himself to be faithful and to be trustworthy. And it's up to us to be trusting of his faithfulness and his trustworthiness. But oftentimes, at least I can speak for myself, I find myself struggling because I don't know what he's going to do. I don't know where the story ends. I don't know where the path leads. And all I see is the ups and downs of it that my mind is producing. And so I want to take control of it. I want to make the valleys flat. I want to make the valleys high and the mountains low, so everything can be flat and I can see the end from the beginning and make it easy for myself. But God never promises us ease. In fact, he promises us that we'll be persecuted and that the world will hate us and that there will be struggles and that there will be hard times. That is promised to us the same way salvation and grace and all these things are promised to us. But the moment that the hard times come, the persecution comes, the moments of uncertainty comes, then we feed and we jump right into it. We forget that God also promises those things. And it might be for our benefit that we go through and that we struggle and that we suffer these things so that we can be strong in our faith, so that we can know that we can rely on God, so that he can build the perseverance and the strength and the knowledge to be able to handle the situations to come. But again, all these things that are happening to Israel are things that happen to us. And so God takes us from Egypt into the wilderness. And oftentimes, I would say all the time, that's where we fail, is in the wilderness. We ask for other gods. It's okay. It's okay. I and so I go back to Lamentations, because you see Jeremiah's, he can see the condition of Israel. He can see the things that I'm talking about, the hardness of their hearts. He can see the sin that stains their souls. He can see the things that they couldn't see for themselves. So I go to Lamentations 2:13, and it's Jeremiah kind of diagnosing the condition of his people. And the reason I say that Lamentations is from Jeremiah, because again, he fits the bill for what he's writing in the book of Lamentations. And if you've never read it, again, I recommend that you do read it, but go into it understanding that it's a book that touches on the things that we might not like to touch on. And so Lamentation chapter 2, verse 13, he says, "Your wound is as deep as the sea. Who can heal you?" And he says this after going through all the things that Israel has suffered because they turned away from God, how the Babylonians invaded and how they killed and how they burned and how they kidnapped and how the people who are left there are just destitute, that they were once, seen as wise and rich, and that they had all the things that the flesh desires, and now they're left crushed and destitute. And really, that's the outcome of sin, is that it'll allow you to gather up and store up all these things and then take them away from you. And now you have nothing. You truly have nothing, because all the things that you built up are taken away, and you also don't have the life giver. You don't have the source of all the good things that you did have. And so you're left with nothing. And Jeremiah sees the condition of his people. He sees that they have been brought so low as to their children beg for bread, that the mother doesn't feed her child, that the mother goes as far as to eat her own child because they're so destitute. And so I say read Lamentations with understanding that it touches on things, the reality of what it looks like to be overtaken by another nation, but to be left destitute by sin. And he sees all this, and again he says, "Your wound is as deep as the sea. Who can heal you?" And it reminded me of Ezekiel as he's taken into the valley of dry bones, and he looks and he sees all these. It's not even dead bodies. They're bodies that have been withered down all the way to their bones, and the bones they're not fresh bones. They're dry bones. They've been sitting there for a while. They've been sitting in the scorching sun. And it reminds me of the Israelites coming out of Egypt. They were physically freed from their captors, but they weren't spiritually free yet. And so they were still dead. They were just a bunch of dead men in the wilderness roaming around. And you see that from the fact that Moses goes away for however long he was. It could have been a week, it could have been a day, we don't know. But he goes away, and they immediately start asking for another God. And so it really stuck with me when he talks about who can heal you, who can repair the condition of this people who are suffering the consequences of their sin, who are just destitute, who can't bring themselves. There is no bootstrap to lift themselves up. They have nothing, have absolutely nothing. And again, that brought me to Ezekiel. And God asked Ezekiel kind of an impossible question. He's looking out over all these dry bones. He's looking in this wilderness of all these I won't even say dead bodies. They're past that point. And he asks them, "Can these bones live?" And human wisdom would tell you, obviously, no, they can't live. They're dead. There's nothing there. They're more than dead. They've been sitting out for a long time in the sun. They're dry bones. They're not just bones. They're dry bones. And so man's wisdom would tell you, no, these things can't live. But God's wisdom says otherwise. And you see 11 verses later that God says, "I will put my spirit in you," speaking to the bones, "and you will live." Because God is able to make what is dead live. He is the source of life. He can cause the dead bones to have flesh come on them and to have their ligaments come back and their sight and all these things, and he can breathe life into what's dead. And so from Jeremiah's lament to Ezekiel's dry bones, you see them in the wilderness. And that wilderness reminded me of where John the Baptist would preach. And I put here, in the wilderness, they waited for a voice. And he was a strange man clothed in camel hair, carrying the gravity of another world. He wasn't just another prophet. In fact, Jesus speaks about him and he says that he's the greatest man born of woman. And so he was a very different and otherworldly and I'm sure he was a strange man to the people who did go out into the wilderness to see him. And I see the similarity in John and Ezekiel because Ezekiel spoke to dead, dry bones, and John spoke to crowds of people, but they both spoke to the dead. And so you see that in the wilderness, God is preparing a way for his people to enter into the promised land, to come to the fullness of being free, not just physically free, but free from the bondage that is sin, which is much worse than the physical bondage, because everybody who's physically bound knows they're bound, but not everybody who is spiritually bound knows that they are bound. And even though you don't know that you're spiritually bound, that won't save you from the consequences of having been a slave to sin. So again, you see another 400 years between the last book of the Old Testament, Micah, and the first book of the New Testament, Matthew. So in their time in Egypt, there was 400 years of bondage. And then you see this. Some Bibles have it. It's a white page that separates the Old Testament from the New Testament. And that page represents another 400 years of silence from God, another 400 years of just rituals and sacrifices, but no, "thus says the Lord," no prophet that is hearing from God. And so you see, bang this lip. You see another 400 years of that silence almost from God. And it's really just another Egypt without the chains. It's they're now producing all these human customs, and they're binding themselves to these things. They're putting themselves back into captivity. And it's not the same captivity as Egypt because now they're not physically bound, although they are under the thumb of Egypt. Now they're leaning fully into being spiritually bound. And that'll come into play when the Messiah does show up because they won't recognize him. Some will, but the religious leaders of the day won't recognize him because they themselves are spiritually dead. They're blind. They can't see. And so here, in that 400 years of silence from God, Right at the very end, you see God appear again. You see him show his hand. You see him show the strength of his arm again to the nation of Israel. And if you'll go with me to Matthew 4, and we're not going to go over the birth of Christ because I'm pretty sure Craig covered that. But I want to cover his time in the wilderness, at least briefly. So it'll be Matthew 4. And let me see. And I'm just going to I'll just start at verse 1 and I'll go through, but I won't read the whole thing. It says, Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, or into the desert, to be tempted by the devil. And so here you see Jesus is almost mirroring the experience of Israel. He goes into Egypt and he's called out of Egypt. So that's a prophecy, not confirmed, but fulfilled. And then you see him go into the wilderness to overcome what the Israelites, or that we couldn't. He goes into the wilderness to do what the Israelites or us couldn't do in the wilderness, which is to overcome temptation, the devil, sin, all these things. He does it with perfection. So verse 2, after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, If you are the Son of God, tell these stones become bread. Jesus answered, It is written, Man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. If you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down, for it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. Jesus answered him, It is also written, Do not put the Lord your God to the test. And so it goes on again. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, Away from me, Satan, for it is written, Worship the Lord your God and serve him only. So you see here that at the points where the Israelites failed, Jesus succeeds. And it's the same for us. It's by his obedience that he's able to make a highway through the wilderness for us to get to the promised land. He didn't fail when he was hungry and thirsty. He didn't fail when he was asked to worship other gods. He didn't fail to even use his God-given abilities to throw himself down and to have angels pick him up. He didn't exercise his divinity for the sake of just doing it or just to prove that he was God. He was submitted to the will of the Father, and he wouldn't do anything unless the Father allowed him or told him to do those things. And so it's by his victory in the wilderness that we are able to approach the throne of God, that the veil is torn and that the throne is open and that the chains are broken, not in a physical sense, but in a spiritual sense, because he succeeded. He was able to live the righteous life that we aren't able to live. And so you see there, the Israelites are taken into the wilderness, and we're also taken into the wilderness, but we failed there. And Christ is taken into the wilderness, but he succeeds there. And so now you have the entering into the promised land, which is what the sermon is, the I guess the flag, the point, the tip of the spear, which is the freedom that comes from Christ's success. And it's not that, again, that freedom in its truest form is a physical freedom, but it's a freedom of your spirit. It's a freedom from sin. It's a freedom from the vices and the evilness of the world. And so the path to the promised land is laid out before us. All that stands between us is all that stands between us and the promised land is our cross. But we have to take it up, we have to carry it. And the better thing to do is to get on the cross like Christ did, to live like he did. And so I have a quote from Tozer. I like Tozer. And he says, always remember, you cannot carry a cross in company. Though a man were surrounded by multitudes, his cross is his alone, and his carrying of it marks him out as a man set apart. That's the difference between a Christian and a worldly person. That you do bear up under your cross, that you do willingly take it, that you don't set it aside so that you can be comfortable in this life, but you take your cross and you carry it to the destination that wherever God is leading you to carry that cross. But I would go further and say that it's upon you to get on the cross when he tells you, okay, this is the spot. You have to surrender all that's you, all of your life. You have to, when a man is on the cross, when he's nailed to the cross, he can't decide, now I want to come down. Now I want to drink of water. Now I want to go do X, Y, and Z. You're completely and utterly surrendered to God. And that's what God desires for and from us. And there's no other way into the promised land other than to carry a cross. That's what bridges the gap between that infinite gap between you and God is the cross. And so to do anything other than to carry it, and I would say to also get on it, there's many people who will bear up under their cross, but they won't actually completely submit. They'll throw it down whenever it's convenient for them. It's easy for me to carry it right now, but when life becomes too hard, I'm going to toss it aside. Maybe I'll come back and pick it up later. But the man who gets on the cross isn't able to come off of it. You've succeeded. You're gonna hurt. It's not gonna be nice. It's gonna be painful to be on the cross, and you're gonna die. But that is the point of it, is that you die, knowing that there's a resurrection on the other side. Without the death, there is no resurrection. But understand, I don't mean that in a physical sense, but a spiritual sense. I'm not telling you go build the cross and get on it, just so we can have that disclaimer. But understand that God requires you to carry that and to get on it and to surrender yourself to him. That's what surrendering to God looks like, and that's what Jesus displayed to us. There is no other way. That is what surrender to God looks like. Taking up your cross, getting on your cross, and being on that cross until you die. And again, it reminds me of another hymn, and I really need to write the names of these hymns down. But it says, go labor on, spend and be spent, thy joy to do thy Father's will. It is the way the master went. Should not the servant tread it still? And essentially it's saying that Jesus went this way. How can we go any other way if he is our master? It's the way he calls us to. He's saying, come this way, follow me. He didn't say follow me up until I get on the cross and then go your own way. It's follow me the whole way. And I went all the way to the cross. It didn't matter if people were bashing me, spitting on me, pulling out my beard hair or just my regular hair, slapping me, whatever the case is. Follow me through all of it. And it's because of the joy that was set before him. It's because he could see what was after the cross. And that's really the joy that we have too. We should know what comes after the cross, the resurrection that comes after that, the power and the glorifying of our bodies and the ability to be able to say that you lived a life that was actually devoted to God. And so that's what God calls us to do. And as strange as that sounds, that's what freedom looks like, is that you do take up, but you willingly take it up and you willingly lay down your life. And so I put here, freedom never comes by freeing the body alone. True freedom demanded the suffering of the innocent one. He bore the crushing weight without bending. He drank the cup of wrath without shrinking. He searched the depths of judgment without losing mercy. And so if you'll turn with me to Isaiah 55. And this is really what I would say freedom, the results of freedom and carrying your cross and getting on your cross results in. And it's Isaiah 55 verse 1. And it says, "Come, you who have no money, come buy and eat. Come to the waters, come without cost." And he's saying you can purchase from me without money. You can quench your thirst without money. You can satisfy your hunger without paying. You can be full while having nothing. That's what freedom looks like. And it's mirrored in John 7, where um, Jesus is saying, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. You'll become the source, the spring of the things that will satisfy. God will put himself in you, and that him being inside of you will cause, whether you have money, whether you have a home to live in, whether you have whatever it is that you desire, you will have all things because you will possess God. And so you can have nothing while having everything. But on the flip side of that, the person in sin can have everything. They can have the house and the home and the money and the cars and whatever it is that a person desires, and still lack everything and have nothing because they don't have God, who is able to give everything, who is everything, who is in everything. And so a man can be emptied of all his earthly treasures and still overflow. He can still have enough to pour out into other people, even though he has absolutely nothing, because he has God. And I close with this. It says, when sin's yoke is shattered, when death is folded into life, when our worth is no longer chained to this body, to dust, that is freedom. That is what it is to enter into the promised land, to no longer be shackled by sin. And also the physical. I mean, it's important that a person isn't physically in slavery too, but a person can be in physical slavery. They can be bound up like Paul was and still be free. But a person can't be spiritually shackled and be any sense of free. And so it's important to understand that. This is why I said it's important to start at the beginning. And I would say, even when you are reading the Bible, I would love for a person to be able to just rush to Jesus. But why rush to Jesus when you won't understand the gravity of who he is and why he came and what he did and how significant it is that he was able to live a perfect life when Moses wasn't able to, Abraham wasn't able to, David wasn't able to, Solomon wasn't able to, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, every person before Christ was unable to do it. Every person failed, no matter how magnificent the prophet was. And you see, even in John the Baptist, the person who got the highest accolade, if you'll call it that, from Christ, which is that he was the greatest born of woman. He was the greatest man to ever be born, and yet he would still be lesser than the least person in the kingdom of God. And so even John the Baptist failed with that type of, with applaud from Christ, that he was the greatest person ever born of a woman. And so even he stumbled. And so you only get the significance of Christ when you can go back and look and see yourself and all these people who failed and how they failed and the diversity of their failures. It wasn't just that they failed and that they wanted a golden calf, but some was money, some was pride, some was sexual sin, some was XYZ, some was violence. It just, sins come in a variety of different colors and shapes and sizes, and it can be very sneaky. But yes, this is freedom, that you can have nothing and have everything if you possess God, that you can have your thirst quenched, that you can have your hunger satisfied if you have God. Um, but yeah, that's it. That's all I got for you guys.